They were winning the war in the air, and yet inside their minds something was slowly breaking apart. By late 1943 and into 1944, the Allied air campaign over Europe had finally begun to succeed in a way it never had before. Bombers were no longer being slaughtered in the numbers that once threatened to end daylight bombing entirely. More aircraft were reaching their targets, and more importantly, more crews were returning home alive. The reason for this shift was clear and undeniable: the arrival of long-range escort fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang. History remembers this aircraft as a symbol of dominance, a technological masterpiece that helped crush German air power. But for the men who flew it, victory was not a celebration. It was a weight that grew heavier with every mission. Most P-51 pilots were very young. Many were barely out of their teens, carrying responsibility far beyond their years. They had trained hard, learned formation flying, gunnery, navigation, and emergency procedures. What they had not been trained for was the kind of psychological strain that escort duty would impose. Escort missions were not short bursts of combat followed by relief. They were long hours of tension, followed by moments of extreme violence, repeated again and again with little time to recover. Every flight began with the knowledge that survival depended not only on skill, but on luck. Flying escort meant staying close to the bombers, no matter what. These bomber formations were massive, slow, and vulnerable, stretching across the sky in rigid boxes that made them easy targets. The fighter's job was not to hunt freely or chase personal victories. Their job was to protect. That meant constant discipline, constant restraint, and constant awareness that if they left their position for even a moment, enemy fighters could slip through and kill dozens of men in seconds. The burden of that responsibility pressed heavily on every pilot in the formation. The flights themselves were physically exhausting. At high altitude, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Oxygen masks were worn for hours, tightening against faces until skin went numb. The engines droned endlessly, a sound that never left the pilot's ears, even long after landing. Hands stiffened in gloves, legs cramped in cramped cockpits, and the cold seeped into the bones. But physical discomfort was only part of the strain. The greater enemy was the waiting. Long stretches of silence where nothing happened, where the sky seemed calm, yet everyone knew that calm could shatter at any moment. When the enemy appeared, it happened fast. German fighters would dive out of the sun or burst through cloud cover, turning peaceful skies into chaos in seconds. There was no time to think, only to react. Pilots had to make split-second decisions while processing fear, responsibility, and survival all at once. A wrong move could mean death, not just for the pilot, but for the bomber crews depending on him. That knowledge never left them. As the war progressed, P-51 pilots followed bombers deeper and deeper into enemy territory. Earlier in the war, fighters had been forced to turn back due to fuel limits, leaving bombers exposed. Now, escorts stayed with them all the way to the target and back. This success came at a cost. It meant pilots were exposed to danger for longer periods on every mission. There was no safe point where the tension eased. The threat was constant from takeoff to landing. They saw things that stayed with them forever. Bombers erupting into fireballs without warning. Aircraft breaking apart midair. Parachutes failing to open. Friends vanishing in seconds, leaving only smoke and silence behind. There was rarely time to grieve. Another mission always waited. Loss became routine, and routine loss slowly eroded the mind. The enemy they faced was not weak or careless. The Luftwaffe was experienced and increasingly desperate. German pilots understood that the bombers were the heart of the Allied strategy. Escort fighters were the shield that had to be broken. This meant P-51 pilots were constantly targeted, constantly tested. Even on missions where no combat occurred, the expectation of violence lingered. Every cloud seemed suspicious. Every reflection of light could be an enemy aircraft diving toward them. Back at base, the pressure did not disappear. Escort pilots judged success differently from fighter aces of earlier years. Their success was measured by bomber survival, not by personal kills. A mission could feel like failure even if the pilot returned safely, simply because too many bombers had been lost. This created a deep sense of guilt. Pilots began to question themselves endlessly, replaying moments in their minds, wondering if a different decision might have saved someone else. The pace of operations made recovery almost impossible. Missions were flown again and again with minimal rest. Sleep was short and often troubled by dreams of fire and falling aircraft. Some pilots became quiet and withdrawn. Others grew tense, irritable, or reckless. At the time, this was rarely acknowledged. Mental strain was poorly understood, and admitting fear was seen as weakness. Pilots learned to hide their emotions, even as the pressure mounted. As Allied air superiority increased, the situation did not become easier for escort pilots. In many ways, it became harder. Winning meant flying more missions, deeper into hostile territory, against an enemy fighting for survival. The skies increasingly belonged to the Allies, but they were still deadly. Victory did not bring relief. It brought expectation, the expectation to keep going, no matter how exhausted the pilots became. By the time preparations for D-Day were underway, many P-51 pilots were already emotionally worn down. They had flown too many missions, seen too much loss, and carried memories they could not escape. Survival itself became a burden. Each time they returned, another empty bunk appeared in the barracks. Another familiar voice was missing. The silence grew heavier. History records the success of the air war in numbers and outcomes. Enemy aircraft destroyed. Bombers protected. Missions completed. What it rarely records is the cost paid in silence. The long flights home where no one spoke. The distant stares of pilots who no longer laughed easily. The quiet moments where victory felt hollow. They were winning the war in the air, but inside their minds, something fragile was slowly breaking, mission by mission. They were expected to keep flying, even when their minds were already exhausted. By 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a relentless pace, and the demands on P-51 pilots were greater than ever before. Escort missions were no longer occasional operations. They had become routine, and that routine was slowly eroding the men tasked with carrying it out. Each mission brought the same cold mornings, the same long briefings, and the same climb to altitude, yet no amount of repetition made it easier. Pilots knew that somewhere in the sky, at any moment, someone would not return. Combat fatigue was a reality they could not escape. Pilots were not given language to describe what they were feeling. Fear had become a constant companion, following them into the mess hall, into their bunks, and into their sleep. Many found themselves staring at the ceiling at night, replaying decisions and moments over and over again, haunted by choices they could not undo. Others woke suddenly, convinced they were still in the cockpit, engines roaring, tracers flashing past the canopy. Mission limits existed on paper, but the reality was harsher. Pilots were told that after a set number of missions, they would be rotated home, yet those numbers constantly shifted. The need for experienced escort pilots outweighed any plan to rest them. Fresh recruits arrived full of confidence, looking to veterans for guidance. Those veterans felt trapped, realizing that their survival made them indispensable, extending their sentence in the sky. The better they flew, the more the command relied on them. Each mission became a calculation, a balance of risk and responsibility, with the lives of the bomber crews pressing down on every decision. Survivors' guilt became an invisible companion. Each safe return was bittersweet, a reminder of the friends who did not make it back. Some pilots stopped celebrating victories, feeling that there was nothing to cheer for when so many had fallen. Others avoided forming close bonds, understanding that attachment only intensified the pain of loss. The airfield became a place of quiet tension, where laughter existed but never lingered. Pilots developed silent ways of coping, staring at the sky in moments of rest, tightening their grip on memories, compartmentalizing emotions that could never be spoken aloud. Commanders focused on results. Bombers were getting through, targets were being struck, enemy resistance was weakening. From a strategic perspective, the system was working. But inside the squadrons, cracks were forming. Pilots who had once flown with perfect discipline now occasionally took unnecessary risks. Others froze at critical moments, paralyzed by fatigue or fear. These were not failures of bravery, but signs of minds pushed beyond their limits. The enemy sensed the pressure as well. The Luftwaffe was losing aircraft and pilots, but adapted with increasing desperation. Head-on attacks against bomber formations became more common. Rocket-armed interceptors appeared over critical targets. Even as Allied control of the skies improved, danger never disappeared. It only shifted, becoming more unpredictable and more lethal. Escort duty was unforgiving because there was no opportunity to disengage. Once bombers were attacked, P-51 pilots could not simply break away when the immediate danger passed. They had to remain vigilant for hours afterward, escorting crippled aircraft struggling to remain airborne. Watching bombers limp home, damaged but still aloft, was often more emotionally taxing than combat itself. Pilots understood that many of those aircraft would ultimately fail, yet they could do nothing but remain close, praying silently for survival. Physical exhaustion compounded mental strain. Long hours at altitude deprived pilots of oxygen, warmth, and nutrition. Dehydration was common, weight loss was noticeable, and fatigue affected coordination and reflexes. Yet medical evaluations rarely addressed psychological health. As long as a pilot could fly, he was expected to do so. Fear was treated as a weakness to overcome, not a signal to assess or relieve. The pressure was constant, unrelenting, and invisible. As preparations intensified for the invasion of Normandy, the stress reached critical levels. Escort pilots were acutely aware that the success of D-Day depended on air superiority. There was no margin for error. Missions increased in frequency, targets moved deeper into enemy territory, and the margin for mistakes disappeared. By the time the invasion began, many pilots were operating on sheer determination, emotional reserves long depleted. Even victories offered little relief. Success meant more missions, more responsibility, and more exposure to the skies where danger lurked constantly. Even after the initial invasion succeeded, the strain did not abate. Missions continued across the European theater. Pilots began counting time not in days, but in missions survived. Every takeoff felt heavier than the last. Every climb into the sky a confrontation with their own mental limits. Some pilots quietly requested transfers or grounding, unable to continue under the pressure. Others persisted until reaction time slowed and judgment became impaired. This was not failure. This was the human mind under sustained and extraordinary stress. Many carried the weight of unseen battles into civilian life after the war. Sleep disturbances, anxiety, and depression were common. Memories of missions, fallen comrades, and near-death experiences resurfaced constantly. The psychological toll of air superiority was profound and lasting. History records the strategic outcomes. Bombers delivered their payloads. Enemy aircraft were destroyed, and the Allies gained air dominance. Yet what history rarely records are the internal struggles, the quiet, unseen battles waged in the minds of those who survived. The men in P-51 cockpits endured far more than the statistics show. Their courage was not merely in facing enemy fire, but in confronting their own fatigue, fear, and guilt, mission after mission. Survival itself became a form of bravery. Each successful return a testament to endurance under extreme conditions. Every pilot carried invisible scars, yet returned day after day to fulfill their duty.